Welcome to this bonus episode of Understand Murdaugh, a podcast from the Post and Courier, where our award-winning reporters bring you the latest news and analysis from the story of drugs, deceit, and death in South Carolina's Lowcountry. I'm your host, Nathan Stevens. Today, I'm with Post and Courier investigative reporter Avery Wilks to address a couple of emailed questions we received through our premium newsletter. Now, if you want to subscribe to that newsletter, you get priority access to Mailbag Q&As like this, and we thought we would follow up and include our answers in this little bonus podcast episode as well.
That's right. Both of these questions came from Lisa in Minneapolis, so thank you to Lisa for that. And they're also pretty timely given the recent events in Murdaugh world. Nathan, can you read Lisa's first question and I will take a swing at answering it?
Sure thing. Okay, Lisa wrote, I've read different things about what is known about the night of the June 7th murders. I read that Maggie texted a friend that Alec asked her to meet him to see his dad in the hospital, and she was suspicious. And it was also said that maybe Paul was coincidentally there because he was taking care of a friend's dog. In the HBO doc, Alec's lawyer said he had dinner with Maggie and Paul and then went to visit his mom. There is supposedly evidence that shows all their phones at the kennels before 9 p.m., right before Maggie and Paul were probably murdered. Can you sort out all these scenarios of what is actually known or theorized about the locations that night and why they were all at Moselle? What was the video on Paul's phone? Was it of all of them taking one together, or was it Paul videotaping the dog and happened to overhear his parents? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, from Minneapolis. This is a great question, and you can bet the conflicting accounts of Alec Murdaugh's alibi are going to take center stage at his double murder trial in January. It has been an exercise in mental gymnastics so far to make sense of that evening's timeline, and hopefully the trial will provide more clarity. For now, let's walk through those various accounts, which we've pulled from court filings, interviews, and statements in court by Murdaugh's lawyers and state prosecutors. So according to State Grand Jury Chief Prosecutor Creighton Waters, Alec Murdaugh initially told investigators that he never went down to the Moselle Estates dog kennels on the evening of June 7th, 2021, before he found Maggie and Paul Murdaugh's bodies there. Now, the dog kennels are a little bit a ways off from the actual house on that estate. And recently, HBO Max aired a 3-part documentary that included an interview with one of Murdaugh's defense attorneys, Jim Griffin. Now, in that interview, which I'm told was recorded earlier this spring, Griffin told HBO that his client came home from work that evening around 6:30 p.m. and had dinner with Maggie and Paul. Afterward, according to Griffin, Murdaugh said he lay on the couch and took a nap. And when he awoke around 9 p.m., Murdaugh called both Maggie and Paul, but got no answer, Griffin said. So Murdaugh texted Maggie, quote, "I'll be right back," end quote, and left shortly after 9 p.m. to visit his mother, Griffin said. So again, this is the account that Murdaugh gave that Griffin relayed to HBO. And again, it squares with what Creighton Waters said that Murdaugh initially told investigators, which is that he did not see Maggie and Paul before leaving that evening to visit his mom. But here's the problem for Murdaugh, and I expect this will become a major point of contention at trial. Since those early statements, investigators have uncovered evidence that reportedly puts Murdaugh at the kennels, which was the scene of the crime, before Maggie and Paul were shot and killed that night. Specifically, in a video recorded on Paul's phone around 8:44 p.m. that day, Alec Murdaugh can be heard speaking with Paul and Maggie. From what I understand, Alec Murdaugh doesn't actually appear on that video, but his voice can be heard in the background. And I've heard that investigators had people who know Murdaugh listen to that clip to verify it was his voice, even before they pressed charges against him in July 2022. So this was obviously a key piece of evidence in their investigation. The fact that it places Murdaugh at the scene of the crime in the minutes or at least a short time before Maggie and Paul were killed. Now, Murdaugh's lawyers have said repeatedly that conversation, which they've heard the audio of, was normal and convivial, not the kind of talk you'd have before going on a murderous rampage. Waters, the prosecutor, has actually agreed with that, though at a recent hearing, he said that's even more proof of how cold-blooded a killer Murdaugh must be. Waters, the prosecutor, also hinted that the state has other cell phone data that places Murdaugh by the kennels that night. At that hearing, which was in October, Waters said that Murdaugh drove off shortly after 9 p.m. that evening, around the time that Maggie and Paul's phone stopped sending messages or moving. And that was according to cell phone data that investigators obtained. So that would mean, at a minimum, that Murdaugh lied to investigators and maybe to his own attorneys in his initial statements about his whereabouts that evening. And I suspect that his attorneys will have to explain to the jury, why would an innocent person lie in that situation? But Waters, the prosecutor, went a step further at that hearing and said, that this evidence definitively shows that Murdaugh was the one who killed Maggie and Paul before, he left Moselle that evening.
Now, since all of that, Murdaugh's legal team filed his formal alibi defense that he'll use at trial, right?
That's right. They filed that on November 17th. It was only about 3 paragraphs long, but it was really insightful and provided some details that we didn't know before. According to that updated alibi, according to Murdaugh's version of events that night that he's going to portray at trial, Maggie and Paul were alive when Murdaugh left Moselle that evening. It said that a few minutes after 9 p.m. on June 7th, 2021, Murdaugh left the Moselle estate to drive to Varnville to visit his mother, Elizabeth Murdaugh, who is elderly and suffers from memory issues. Murdaugh said he spoke with several people on the phone during that drive, including his son Buster, his brother John Marvin, and his sister-in-law Liz Murdaugh. Murdaugh also spoke with Bamberg attorney Chris Wilson and C.B. Rowe, who is a farmhand on the Moselle property. Now, Wilson, the attorney, has confirmed speaking with Murdaugh twice that evening. And I spoke with John Marvin Murdaugh after this alibi was filed, and he confirmed that he spoke briefly with his older brother shortly after 9 p.m. John Marvin said that their conversation was again, brief, but quite normal, and nothing seemed amiss. And I think that's going to be part of Murdaugh's defense at trial, is that, he's talking to all of these people, and these conversations are incredibly normal and just sort of matter of fact, which is not what you would expect after you've killed 2 people, especially your wife and child. Now, back to the alibi. Murdaugh said he arrived at his mother's place around 9:20 p.m. and stayed with her and an aide named Shelley Smith until about 9:45 p.m. Murdaugh said he spoke with Wilson, the attorney, on the phone as he drove back to Moselle, and he arrived back at the property around 10 p.m. Now, Wilson, of course, was the attorney who worked with Murdaugh on a major case, a very lucrative case, in which Murdaugh's share of the legal fees went missing. The chief financial officer of Murdaugh's law firm apparently had confronted Murdaugh about the missing fees earlier that morning, the morning of the slayings. So there has been plenty of speculation about what those calls between Wilson and Murdaugh were about. And then, as we know, Murdaugh discovered Maggie and Paul's bodies there at about 10:05 p.m., and he called 911 at about 10:06 p.m. that evening. Murdaugh's lawyers have said that while he was on the phone, he went and grabbed a gun to defend himself, presumably to protect himself in case Maggie and Paul's killer or killers were still on the grounds. And there has also been some discussion about gunshot residue particles that were found on Murdaugh's clothes that evening. Murdaugh's attorneys have acknowledged that there were particles found on his clothes, but said they were in such small amounts and that those amounts are consistent with him picking up that separate gun, which wasn't the murder weapon, and carrying it for his protection. So that's all we know from what we've heard about the timeline of events that evening.
So Lisa also asked about why Maggie and Paul were there that evening. What's known about that?
I don't know for sure why they were there that evening, though I'm sure I've read the same things that you all have. I don't know if Paul typically stayed at the Moselle estate. I understand that Alec did. It was his primary residence. But we do know that Maggie had been staying at the family's house on Edisto Beach. Some have pointed to that as evidence of a distancing in their relationship between Maggie and Alec Murdaugh. There was that People magazine report that Maggie had seen a divorce lawyer in the weeks before the slayings. Murdaugh's legal team strongly pushed back on that report. They said they had gone through all the texts between the couple, and those messages were very loving and consistent with a good marriage. Jim Griffin, one of Murdaugh's attorneys, said on the HBO documentary that Maggie had actually been staying at Ediso because she was uncomfortable being around Hampton after the scrutiny and stigma that had become attached to the Murdaugh family after the 2019 boat crash that killed 19-year-old Mallory Beach. So Griffin also said that the three of them had dinner that evening before Maggie and Paul were killed. So it's possible that they, met up to have dinner. That's a long answer, but hopefully it covers what we know and what we don't know about the events that evening.
All right, let's get on to the next question. Does anyone know or have some theories about what was found after Maggie and Paul were murdered that caused the Stephen Smith case to be reopened?
This answer will be more brief. We don't know. We don't even really have a theory that's worth mentioning here. I thought the HBO documentary did the best job I've seen yet of pulling together all of the questions and the various, threads surrounding Stephen's death in 2015 and the Murdaugh's rumored ties to it. The Smith family is convinced that Stephen was killed based on all the evidence in that case. The family's new attorney, Mike Hemlip, has said it's clear that the 19-year-old was killed because of his sexuality. And we know that the state law enforcement division reopened an investigation into Smith's death just 2 weeks after Maggie and Paul were killed. According to an agency spokesman at the time, that was because of, quote, information gathered during the course of the double murder investigation of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh, end quote. But they didn't say what that investigation was. But that decision followed media reports and social media posts raising questions about Smith's death, which pointed out that the Murdaugh name appeared a number of times in the investigative report on Smith's case. Still, in the year and a half since then, SLED hasn't provided any meaningful updates on that investigation. Smith's family and its supporters continue to urge anyone who knows what really happened to Stephen to come forward, but it doesn't seem like we're any closer to having a definitive answer than we were 18 months ago.
Okay, I appreciate it, Avery. Thank you. And that's all for now. We'd like to keep doing these Murdaugh mailbags periodically, so please submit your questions. You can do that through our premium newsletter service or by emailing us at murdaugh@postandcourier.com. That's murdaugh@postandcourier.com. We're happy to answer questions you have about the Murdaugh Saga and our coverage of this case. As always, stay tuned with the Post and Courier for the latest updates in the case. You can follow us on Twitter @Post and Courier. You can find all of our latest coverage on our Murdaugh landing page, postandcourier.com/Murdaugh. Also, please take a minute to leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you like the show. We'll see you next time.